All right, well, today we are back to work on the Turbo LS street truck. So we've been working on getting this thing dialed, and it's pretty much there. We got it from that last 90% to everything's cooling well, it drives well, the cruise control works, it makes good power, we've two-stepped it, we've launched it, we've done actually quite a few passes on this thing as it sits. So now that it's working correctly, the next logical thing to do is to make it faster. So this has kind of always been in the plan. Basically, the fuel system we have in this truck right now is a great setup for where the truck is. You know, 600 or 700 horsepower and pump gas. We've got some Deechworks 750cc injectors, and then we've got their really trick 450 liter per hour fuel pump that's built into the same housing as the stock housing. So it just drops into the tank, uses the stock lines, very simple setup, but we want to make some more power, and more importantly, we want to switch it to E. Now with E, the benefit is it's a lot safer, you can make more power, but you need a lot more fuel flow even at the same power level. So we basically need to redo the whole fuel system, and if we're going to redo the whole fuel system, we might as well upgrade it to the point where it's capable of the 1,000 plus that I built the engine to be capable of. So that is where we're starting today, so that way we can put it on E, since we now have it locally, and start making some real power and trying to go really fast with this thing. So that's step one. Let me show you what we've got to go on this thing, because we have a lot of parts for this thing. It's gonna be a pretty elaborate project, but I think it should be a really nice setup when we're all said and done. It's been a while. Let's do the old snap trick here. All right, so here we have our entire fuel system from Deechworks. We are replacing literally everything. We've got fittings, we've got lines, we've got wiring, we've got pumps, we've got fuel rails, we've got all the basic stuff, you know, fuel filter, injectors, regulator. We are gonna be running a content sensor. This is huge. So we could just put it on E and have enough fuel system for it, but this is gonna allow us to automate the process of switching between pump gas and E. We'll get more into that when we start dialing it in on the tune. But really the star of the show is the surge tank here. This is what's going to allow us to make a bunch of power without having to mess around too much with the stock tank system. That's going to kind of remain the same. So that being said, the first order of business is going to be to get this thing lifted up. We need to drop the stock tank so we can put some fittings on. We need to get all the lines out. We're not reusing any of that, none of the lines, not the rails. The majority of this needs to come out. So we got a bit of work to do before we can start installing the nice shiny new parts. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering. We're gonna get to work. So we started getting ready to remove the stock fuel tank. I'm very glad I have a transmission jack for situations like this. Now, I've actually pulled this tank a couple of times. Obviously, the first time was to put the Deechworks drop-in pump assembly in, and then we also had to drop it out just to get the leaf spring bolts out to do the drop kit. So I'm no stranger to the process, but it is a little bit tricky. The filler neck does not like to come off with the hose clamp, so you got to unbolt it. But other than that, it comes out pretty easy. There's not too much in the way of dropping it down out of the way. So now that we've got it out, it's time to take all this kind of ancillary stuff that we're not really going to need anymore now that we're not using the stock tank, stock fuel system. And the biggest thing being these hard lines. Now, it's nice to have the hard lines, but they're just a restriction at this point. Even if we wanted to adapt to them, which we could, they're just too small of a diameter to flow the amount of fuel that we're going to need to flow. So they got to come out, and they're not really meant to come out. So we've pretty much got to cut them in sections and take them out piece by piece. So once I got the majority of them done up to the transmission, I needed to pop up top to the rails, disconnect them up there, and go ahead and work on getting the fuel rails out. So these already do have aftermarket injectors. We have 750cc Deechworks in here and their regulator. And again, this setup has worked really well for a 600 or 700 horsepower street truck, which is really all you need. This setup is honestly perfect. It's very simple, very easy to install, affordable. It's a great setup, but we like to go overkill and overboard on things, and I want to make a lot of power with this truck, and I want to try to go fast, and you know, you got to do what you got to do. Not to mention, really the biggest thing that pushed me to make this change and go ahead and do this fuel system is that we finally got E85 locally. Before, it was about a 30-minute drive to go get E. So I got the rails out. I had to fight with the injectors. They were in there good. And then we could go ahead and pull these last few hard lines out of our way so that we can start fresh with all new lines and fittings and routing and mounting, all fresh, clean, and simple. Well, I put my fan up. I had to have the fan running, back door open, front doors open to try to clear some of the pump gas stink out of here. That is the downside. You know, there's pros and cons to running E85 versus pump gas or pump gas versus E. You know, the downside to E85 is you need more fuel system, which is why we're doing this, especially if you want to make more power. And if you let it sit for a while, it can corrode, it collects moisture, it can gum up, it can degrade lines, you know, so there's definitely some negatives. But my biggest positive, honestly, for running E and why I run it in all the race cars that are getting taken apart and serviced regularly is that when you do have to take it apart, it's literally just alcohol. It dumps out, gets on your hand, gets on the floor. It's literally like just pouring a bottle of alcohol on the ground because it's corn. Whereas with pump gas, it's gasoline. It stinks. It gets into your clothes, into your skin. You can't get the smell out. It's nasty stuff. So definitely a not very talked about benefit of running E85. It's not so messy when you got to service it. So that being said, we did go ahead and get all of the stock fuel lines out, every single last one of them, all the way out. We got the rails off. We are basically at zero. We have no fuel system. Basically, we get to start from scratch, which is always very satisfying in the way to do it. So that being said, our starting point is over here with the stock fuel tanks still. So fortunately, we already have this Deechworks fuel pump assembly that's good for all of the flow we're going to need to the surge tank. So this is going to stay, stock tank's going to stay, but we basically are starting from here with our lines and our plumbing. Now, since this Deechworks setup is a drop-in OE style replacement, it uses the OE quick connect lines, which ours are all cut apart in pieces at the bottom of this trash can. Now, fortunately, they do offer a solution for this. Something I've used before in the past for content sensors and things. It's these adapter fittings. These are really trick because basically you put these two pieces on. This has O-rings down inside it. It slides over that outlet. You screw this together, and then you basically have an AN fitting right off of your fuel hat. We've got 8 for our feed, 6 for our return. So that means that we don't have to fiddle around with going back and forth between the stock lines and AN. We're gonna be doing AN from the stock tank all the way out through the rest of the truck. All of it will be AN, which is important because with E85, you wanna have E85 rated line all the way through. So A1. That being said, first order of business is going to be to get those adapter fittings on, make sure they fit, everything's good there, and then get the tank probably cleaned up, probably do a quick vacuum job, and then get the tank tossed back in there so we can start planning and plotting where everything's going to go. That being said, you know the deal. I'm going to quit jibber jabbering. We're going to get to it. Back to it. We've been at it. Back. All right. Before I could put the new fittings on, I had to get the little plastic clips for the stock quick connects off, and then putting the new fittings on is super simple. These are such a neat item to have when you're converting something to AN, not having to deal with any sort of hard lines or anything like that. Went ahead and did a quick vacuum job. It's crazy how dirty this tank has gotten because I cleaned it pretty thoroughly when I put that pump in originally. So, you know, that was a long time ago now, but the truck hasn't been driven that much because we've been working at that kind of 90% done range for a while. I mean, we've really just got it to the point where it's a good solid street truck. So, and then we tore it apart to do a new fuel system, but hey. That's the way it goes sometimes. So got the tank back in, straps bolted back up. The last thing really is just to attach the filler neck, which is a little bit tricky with one person, but I managed to get it bolted back on so that way we don't forget later. All right, we got our stock fuel tank tossed back in. Definitely a lot easier now without the charcoal canister and stuff. We got the filler neck hooked back up because I did test fit my hand up there, and I should be able to get in there and connect and disconnect the lines at the top of the tank without having to unbolt it and drop it down, which is important because we need it to be in its final location to determine the line length, but you know, if we couldn't get to them, that would make that a challenge. So good news there, that should make our lives a lot simpler in building and making our lines for back here. So the next step is gonna be fitting everything that we've got fuel system wise to go in the bed of the truck. So really the crown jewel of the fuel system is this surge tank here. So this is a 5.5 liter surge tank. I have the same exact one in my Miata. I've had phenomenal luck with it. This thing can fit 3 over 400 liter per hour feed pumps, which my vet has a in-tank surge tank in the fuel cell, and I'm only running 2 pumps to make 1100 on E85. So this thing has tons of headroom. We'll never have to worry about running out of fuel, no matter how much our power goals may potentially change in the future on this truck. And not to mention the surge tank setup works really well for not having to deal with fuel slosh and things like that. So it's kind of like this is its own little fuel cell that's being automatically replenished by the stock tank. So I love surge tanks. I think they're the way to go if you're trying to make any bit of power, especially on E. It gives you lots of headroom and you don't have to worry about fuel slosh and fuel cut, which can go really badly. So that being said, that's the thing that really needs to get mounted first. So then we have point A at the stock tank, point B at our surge tank, and then we can start connecting the dots and moving forward from there. So a whole lot of jibber jabber to say. It's time to get back to work. I'm gonna get to it. All right, so I think I wanna tuck this thing as far in this corner as I can. So it doesn't really line up on the ridges like that, where we need to bolt it in, but I think, yeah, if we turn it sideways, which actually we'll probably do it this way, so the wires are on this side, we can just get it to be on the ridges. This is a difficult thing about mounting something in the bed of a truck. You're constantly dealing with the ridges, but that should work. We can tuck our wiring down this way, keep that nice and clean, and our lines can go out this way. I think that's gonna be the move. So really we just need to mark it, punch it, drill it, rivet it, bop it, twist it. You know the deal. One of the biggest areas I've improved on as a car builder, mechanic, whatever you want to call me, is getting my holes to all line up when I'm mounting something. In the early days, I was terrible about this. You know, I would rough mark them and then I'd drill them and then the holes would be way off. And you can't risk that with riv nuts because you can't move it. You can't just oblong the hole. So I was really, really careful to make sure I had a good mark on these. And the bed was fighting me. You know, my automatic center punches, my transfer punches, nothing was leaving a nice solid mark for me to commit to. So I had to do it a few times, but we managed to get the first 2 in. If it's something like this where there's 4, if I feel like I can't get it 100% accurate, I'll do 2 riv nuts, bolt it in, and then that way it is for sure set in place where it needs to be before I mark the other 2 holes. Because if it just moves a little bit, each time you mark a hole, you're gonna have one that's completely off. And I know that from experience because, again, I used to be terrible about this and rushing it, and then I'd end up with only getting 3 bolts on something that needs 4. So we managed to get all the riv nuts in. They all look like they're gonna line up. So we went ahead and vacuumed out the area where the surge tank goes, which led into a little bit of a rabbit hole vacuuming out this crease in the bed while we were at it. And then it was time to bolt this thing in and see if it's solid, give it the old shake test, and make sure it ain't going nowhere. So, look at that, fits in that corner like a glove. Like I said, wiring down this way, tucked back in this corner, out of sight, out of mind, out of harm's way. And then our fuel line's going this way. That's kind of the next thing we need to determine. We'll have 2 going to the engine and 2 going to and from the stock fuel tank. But they're all gonna need to go through the bed and then underneath the truck. So for that, we have something really cool from Deechworks as well. Turn this light off. Where did I put it? Here it is. They've got this bulkhead here. So we're gonna thread ORB fittings in here, and then our AN lines will connect to them. And this will be our bulkhead through the bed of the truck. So instead of running lines through holes with grommets or whatever, we're gonna bolt it in here. So the lines are gonna come from the surge tank to this, and then out of the bottom to where they need to go. So this is kind of our next step. We need to know where we wanna put this. Where we wanna put it kind of depends on where do we want our lines to go in from the top and out from the bottom. We're probably gonna have to make a compromise there. Like, there might be a spot that's good from the top and not from the bottom, and vice versa. So I'm gonna lift the truck up and do kind of a little look through and see what our options are. So after lifting the truck up and looking at every which way, we could come at this with this bulkhead, I decided that by the surge tank was really the best spot for all of the line routing. You know, it's kind of like you got to compromise on the lines to the tank to get better route for the lines up to the rail and so on and so forth. And really, protection is a big thing for me when mounting stuff like this. I want to make sure that the lines are as out of harm's way as they can be. So this was the best place, and it should look the cleanest because it's right next to the surge tank. So after we got our hole drilled through the bed, I didn't have the exact size hole saw I needed, so we had to use the carbide burr to open it up just a little bit, and then once we had it open, we had to trim into the ridges a little bit to get it to sit down flush, but we've got it fitting nice, so we get the hole cleaned up just to make sure there's no sharp, jagged edges to catch on anything. Another vacuum job, and our bulkhead is officially mounted. All right, well, our bulkhead is in. We got it sitting in there nice and flush, nice and solid. Just need to snug it up a little more and tighten the set screws, but that is done. So we've got our bulkhead, we've got our mount for our surge tank, so all of that is ready to go. But before we put the surge tank back in and start making lines, we need to basically build out the surge tank, install everything in it, get the wiring hooked up, get the lines hooked up, get all that done, tidied up, and then we can start making lines from it to the rest of the truck. So let's take this thing apart and get to work building it out. So here's a look at this, basically how it works. We've got our wiring studs powering down to the fuel pumps. We've got this section here. So we're gonna have barb fittings there, and the pumps are gonna all feed into this, which then feeds out here. And then we got our mount where the pumps go. You can see these have these O-rings. It's kind of like a press fit. They slide in there and hold themselves tight. And then our other three holes are feed in from the tank, return to the tank, and return from the rails. So pretty simple, all in all. It is a little bit tricky to get 3 large pumps all in this tight area and make sure they're the right depth to get to the bottom of the tank. So we got to take our time here and make sure we do this right. So fortunately, I have done quite a few surge tanks now. The one in my Miata, the one in the Vet is also from Deechworks. It's a little different style because it mounts into the fuel cell, but same basic concept. Again, you're kind of cramming a bunch of stuff in a small area, and what's really important is getting the hoses cut to the right length so that the pumps sit at the right depth, so that way they don't touch the bottom of the tank and that the fuel hanger can sit flush and bolt all the way down, but they're also as far down there as they can be, so that way, you know, you can run the tank really low if you need to. So I got them all measured out, cut to length, and then we could start installing them. Now you'll see that I have a green fuel sock on one, and that's because that is kind of the main pump, and there's just enough room to fit one of those big socks. So I thought we'd have the big sock on the pump that's going to be running most of the time, because these are going to be staged. They're not going to all run all the time. The extra pumps are only going to run when they need to run, when we're in boost, making power, and we need all that fuel flow. So I went ahead and got the wiring set up, got my ring terminals crimped on, and then started mounting them in and hooking up all the wires, trying to keep everything kind of tight and in the footprint so nothing catches on the rim of this and we don't end up with it not sealing. We need a really good seal here because this has to be fuel tight. Fuel's going to be full to the brim, and if it sloshes around and that seal's not perfect, we're going to have a fuel leak. So it's important that this thing is sealed up tight and we don't have to worry about that. So once I got the fuel hat bolted back in, I could start putting all of my different fittings in for the different lines. Like I said, there's 4 lines that are going to come in and out of this surge tank. So once it's pretty much fully assembled, we went ahead and bolted it back in. And I'm realizing that where my bulkhead is, if I rotate the hat 90 degrees, I should have a better kind of run from the fittings on the surge tank into the bulkhead. So I rotated that and then went ahead and started installing our fittings in our bulkhead. Now, the downside to a bulkhead is you do have a lot more fittings, but it is just a much cleaner, nicer, more serviceable way to do it. So we went ahead and got those in and started getting all of our lines fittings in to see how that was going to look and if our kind of game plan with the top orientation would work. Man, I am really, really loving how this is coming out so far. With the surge tank in there, the fittings in the bulkhead, we've got our mock-up fittings for our lines in place. Super, super satisfying. So that being said, it's time to start making some lines. We're gonna have to be real precise with this one. So after a quick pet break with Ella, I got to work on one of my least favorite types of projects when it comes to building a car, and that is doing AN lines. And of course, we're doing PTFE lines, which are a bit trickier to do than your standard AN rubber lines, but they do have some enormous benefits. So the PTFE liner, it doesn't degrade as easily as a rubber liner when it comes to running fuels like ethanol or alcohol. So it's worth the upgrade for me and the extra bit of hassle and the extra bit of cost, because if your line degrades and it clogs up your injectors, it could cost you an engine. So I learned that lesson the hard way with rubber lines on my Miata for the early days, and ever since then, if it is a fuel system that's going to run E, I run PTFE lines, and everything else, can get rubber lines. But another benefit to the PTFE lines is that they're a lot smaller than an equivalent rubber line because the liner is so much thinner. So you get the same inside diameter, the same flow amount, but with a much smaller, lighter package. Now, don't get me wrong, weight isn't a huge concern with this truck, but hey, I'll take some weight savings if I can get them. I'm definitely not complaining about that, but really, the biggest downside is just the preparation to put the lines and fittings together. There's a few more steps when it comes to a PTFE line, but once you get used to it, it's really not all that bad. So the way I like to make lines is I put one fitting on, and then I run the whole spool to where the next fitting is, and then I mark it, and then I cut it. So I know that it's accurate and it's the length it needs to be. Now, I do have a tendency to make lines too long. I play it a little too safe, and that comes back to bite me. But in this scenario, these lines are so short that it's gonna look ridiculous if they're too long. So I had to take the risk and try to get it right on every single line, which was not very easy. Ooh, man, I gotta say, I am incredibly pleased with that. That came out every bit as good as I could have hoped. Very, very satisfying project. Some car projects are satisfying, or extra satisfying, and this is definitely one of those projects. Very, very satisfying. Not only do I love the way it looks, but functionally, it's a very compact package. We've got pretty much the whole bed left still to use, but we've got this thing in a place where it's serviceable, it's accessible, it's out of harm's way, it's away from heat, all of those things. So shout out to Brandon at Deechworks for recommending this bulkhead. That was definitely the way to go. It looks so clean like that, makes it more serviceable. All in all, A1. Very stoked on that. Got the line links right to where they all have a similar bend radius. Could not be happier, honestly. Looks freaking sick. And honestly, I'm glad we ended up doing it in the bed because it's kind of like a showpiece. Looks cool back there versus having it hidden away. So we need to start working on the lines underneath. So the next set of lines I want to do is going to be from the bulkhead to the tank. The lines that are going to feed and return the surge tank. Those might be a little bit tricky, just getting up to the top of the tank. So I want to get those knocked out. I'll feel good once those are done. And we can stamp that as done and dusted. So I'm going to quit jibber jabber and I'm going to lift this thing back up and we're going to get back to work. So with the easy, accessible lines done, it's time to move on to probably the most challenging pair of lines on this whole project, which is these going from the tank, just because it's in a tight area, which makes it a little bit more difficult to determine your line length and get everything cut to shape and just get everything hooked up. My head just barely fits between the drive shaft and the exhaust to kind of get up in there and see what I'm doing on the top of the tank. I have a big head, so maybe a normal size head would fit, but mine doesn't. So I've got to get a little creative, but we get the first fitting on, we get the line routed to the easy side to get to, which in this case is the bulkhead, so that way we can mark it. That's the way I generally like to do it. Start with the fitting on the hardest side to get to, and then route to the easy side. So that way you can easily get in there and make sure that you're marking it in the right place and you don't make it too short or too long. So these, we definitely want to take our time and make sure we get them right because we don't want to have to redo them if they leak. Now, fortunately, these Deechworks fittings and lines go together pretty well. It's important to always try to use the same brand line as fittings because even if you have one size line and one size fitting and they're technically the same and compatible, they don't always fit together well, and it's generally a lot easier when they're designed to be put together and work with each other. So we got the Dash 8 feed line done. We're running a Dash 8 feed and a Dash 6 return on this truck from front to back, even from the tank to the surge tank. And that's because you're generally going to need more fuel on the feed side than you are on the return side. You're not going to be returning as much fuel as you're sending in theory because you're going to be using it. And it also helps make it a little bit easier to identify which line is a return line and which line is a feed line when you're working under there trying to fix something or find an issue. Alrighty, well, we officially have all of our lines back here done. Got those two going to the stock tank. I don't even know if I can squeeze you up here, like my head. But you can see them there. Definitely a little challenging, but we got it done without dropping the tank. So those are done. All that's left is our lines going forward up to the engine. So Got our feed there, got our return there. They're probably gonna go something like that, maybe ride down along the frame rail. So we still gotta determine where we wanna put the filter and where we wanna put the content sensor. But before we start routing those lines, we need a point B. We have our point A, which is the surge tank and the stock tank, but now we need point B, where are the lines going to? So it's time to move back up top and back to the front of the truck to start working on the rails, injectors, fuel pressure regulator, and all of that jazz so that we have somewhere to actually connect to. All right, so the first thing we need to tackle is fuel rails and injectors. So we have some aftermarket Deechworks rails, which I was really excited when they came out with truck rails, because I like running the truck intake for a few reasons, but you know, I'm not a fan of the stock plastic rails with the quick connects. So we got the rails, we got injectors, we got fittings, regulator, all of that stuff. First step is gonna be mocking up our rails, making sure we got the right combination of brackets. And then we can do the injectors and start doing fittings and lines and see where we wanna mount our regulator, all that good stuff. So we're on the home stretch, we're getting there. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering and get back to work. So the first order of business was to get the brackets bolted onto the fuel rails so that way we could test fit these, mock them up, and make sure that they're gonna work and the brackets are right and we've got the right size fuel injectors. You know, there's kind of a lot of pieces to the puzzle with really building these kind of cars in general, but fuel systems, all of it. And it's important to make sure it's all gonna work together. And fuel is no joke, you know. If you have a fuel leak, it can go really wrong. So fortunately, it looks like these brackets are right for our intake manifold, and this is going to work. So we can go ahead and toss the injectors in and then get the fuel rails popped on. Sometimes it's so hit or miss with rails and injectors and manifolds. Sometimes they are an absolute fight, like getting out the injectors that we had in here. And sometimes they go together really nice, which this was the latter. These popped right on, that real satisfying little snap into place. You know, they got to be tight to seal, but they're not so tight that it is an absolute fight to get it to come apart. So once the rails are in, we've got an idea of where our fittings are going to be, where our lines are going to come in and out, so we can start mounting the fuel pressure regulator. Now, for this being a full-size truck, you would think that there would just be room aplenty. You would have room everywhere for everything, but that's really not the case. There's not a lot of real estate under the hood of this thing, but I did manage to find a spot that I liked and get a rib nut put in, add a little bit more bend to the bracket to try to kind of level out the regulator some, and then we could get all of our fittings in. I also went ahead and tossed the mechanical gauge that comes with the regulator on. Now, we're going to be running an electronic gauge to the Holly, which we're putting in the fuel rail, but I like to have a mechanical gauge in there. It just makes it easier when you're setting fuel pressure because the gauge is right in front of you. And if you ever question the electric pressure sensor, if you are having an issue or it's not reading, it doesn't make sense, then you have a mechanical backup. And fuel pressure is kind of fuel in general is the lifeblood of your engine. You run out of fuel in boost and you melt things. So having a good fuel system and having a good oil system goes a very, very long way to keeping your engine alive. So once we had all the hardware mounted, it was time for some more lines. So we got to do the crossover. Now, unfortunately, with this truck intake, there's a lot of challenges. You know, the cruise control cable and the height of the intake and then the alternator being mounted up top. We had to get a little weird with the crossover line and get a little creative and run it up over top all awkwardly. This is normally really easy with the car style manifold, but you know, unfortunately, this one's not going to be the prettiest looking line of the bunch. I'll just say that. It's unfortunate because it's up front and center, but you got to do what you got to do sometimes. I'm committed to keeping this dang truck intake. So with that done, we got the back line done, going back to the regulator, and this part of the project is wrapped up. All right, well, all of our hardware is in. You've got the fuel pressure sensor in, and almost all of our lines are done. So we've got our crossover. Don't mind it looking kind of silly. It's just to clear the cruise control cable, and it has to go over the top. It can't go over the bottom because of this fitting here, this room behind the alternator. But I mean, the whole reason I've kept and held on to running the stock truck intake is so I can have cruise control, and that's really kind of what made this difficult for us. But it's not too bad. It's done. Cross over to this rail, boom, and then out of this rail and into the regulator. So basically we're gonna feed into that rail, go all the way through into the regulator, and then out the bottom of the regulator, and then back to our bulkhead here and back into the surge tank, and then have our feed out from here. So really all that's left on the line side of things is the feed going up to the front and the return coming back. Now, as much as I'd love to wrap this up right now and get those last little bit of lines finished out, we do have something that we need to do in the meantime. The truck is really low, but I tinkered with the height and I got it about perfect where it still looks good. It's about as low as it can be and still functional. You know, you can get in and out of most places. It's not scraping and bottoming out on everything, except for the transmission mount. The transmission mount hangs about 2 inches lower than everything else, and it's in the middle, so you know, you go over a speed bump and it just drags. I mean, it scrapes on everything, but nothing else does. So I'm gonna take this opportunity while we don't have any lines running through there, right over top of it, to cut it out and build a new one that's tucked up high. And then we should be dialed on ride height. Nice and low, but still plenty functional. That's what I'm always going for. So that being said, that's what's next. We got to rebuild the transmission mount before we can do those lines. Then we get to knock those lines out, and then we can fill it up with E85 and then go test it out. Plus, it's not like even if we got it done, we could test it out tonight because it's raining, and it's going to rain all day tomorrow too. So I think that's a sign to call it. It's been a long few days working on this thing, but it has been a very satisfying project. I've enjoyed it, and I'm really excited to see what this thing feels like on E. So that's all in store for next video, but for now we are out of time. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it here. But I do wanna say thank you for watching, thanks for subscribing, and I sure hope I get to see you next time. Goodbye.